Chris, Jason, Eric, Melissa, and Danielle were more than best friends. They were inseparable, untouchable, and fearless. But one reckless night, fueled by alcohol and hidden desires, shattered their bond forever. What started as a party ended in blood, betrayal, and death, proving that even the closest friendships can hide the darkest secrets. Chris, Jason, Eric, Melissa, and Danielle had been inseparable since childhood. Growing up in the same suburban neighborhood, they did everything together, playing in the streets until the streetlights came on, sneaking out past curfew, covering for each other whenever they got into trouble. Their bond was unshakable, built on years of trust, secrets, and shared experiences. When it came time for college, they made a pact to stick together. Instead of going their separate ways, they chose the same university and moved into a house off campus. It was supposed to be the ultimate freedom. No parents, no rules, just five best friends taking on the world together. At first, everything felt perfect. Their house became the center of attention, the go-to spot for parties, late-night hangouts, and a place where anything was possible. Chris naturally took the role of leader. Charismatic and dominant, he had a way of making people follow him without question. Jason and Eric, always his right-hand men, backed him in everything he did. Melissa and Danielle, though equally part of the group, found themselves often playing the role of peacekeepers, mediating whenever tensions arose. As the months passed, the dynamic between them began to shift. Chris had always been possessive, but now it was becoming more obvious. He controlled the plans, dictated who was invited to their parties, and made sure everyone stayed in line. Jason and Eric followed his lead, never questioning his authority. Melissa, always sharp and observant, started noticing the changes first. She saw how Chris would subtly manipulate conversations, how he could twist situations to make people agree with him. But she stayed quiet, convincing herself it was just his personality, that it was harmless. Danielle, the quietest of the group, remained oblivious to the undercurrents. Sweet and trusting, she saw her friends as family, never once considering the possibility that they could hurt her. She never noticed how Chris watched her more than the others, how he controlled her drinking at parties, how he steered her away from other people. Their parties grew wilder with each weekend. Alcohol flowed freely, and lines that once existed began to blur. The five of them shared everything: drinks, secrets, even relationships. What started as harmless fun became something darker. They experimented, tested boundaries, and pushed limits. Chris was always at the center of it, pulling the strings, deciding who did what and with whom. Jason and Eric followed his lead, their loyalty unwavering. Melissa felt uneasy but said nothing. Danielle remained unaware of how deep the control had gone. It was only a matter of time before something snapped. The perfect image they had crafted of themselves was beginning to crack, and the tension beneath the surface was growing stronger. Their bond, once unbreakable, was heading toward destruction. They just didn't know it yet. The party started like any other, with music blasting through the house, alcohol flowing freely, and the usual crowd filling every corner of the rooms. It was their way of maintaining their status. Chris, Jason, Eric, Melissa, and Danielle weren't just friends. They were legends on campus. Their house had become the go-to spot for reckless nights, and they made sure no one ever forgot it. Chris had planned this night carefully. It wasn't just another party. It was a test, a game he had been playing in his head for weeks. He watched as the night unfolded, controlling everything without anyone realizing it. He made sure Danielle drank more than usual, handing her drink after drink, making sure her glass was never empty. She laughed, oblivious to the way he monitored her, how his eyes never left her. Jason and Eric caught on quickly, exchanging glances with Chris, understanding what he wanted without needing words. Melissa, on the other hand, felt the unease creeping up her spine. Something about the way Danielle was drinking, the way Chris was guiding the night, felt wrong. She tried to intervene, to slow Danielle down, but Chris brushed her off, flashing that familiar smirk that always made people second-guess themselves. As the party raged on, Danielle lost track of time. The lights blurred, faces blended together, and everything felt like a dream. She let herself be led from the crowded living room to a quieter part of the house, unaware of how planned every step was. The music outside continued pounding. drowning out anything happening behind closed doors. Jason and Eric followed, their movements in sync with Chris's silent commands. Danielle was too far gone to notice the shift in the atmosphere, the way the energy in the room had changed. Melissa saw them disappear and hesitated. She knew something was wrong, but fear kept her frozen. The hours passed and the party began winding down. People left in groups, laughing, unaware of what had happened inside. The house grew quieter, the chaos replaced by an eerie stillness. Danielle reappeared sometime later, her steps unsteady, her face pale. She didn't speak, didn't acknowledge anyone. She grabbed her things and left without saying a word. Melissa felt her stomach sink. She wanted to stop Danielle, to ask what had happened, but the fear of knowing the answer kept her rooted in place. Chris, Jason, and Eric acted as if nothing was wrong, cracking jokes, finishing off their drinks, completely unbothered. The night ended, but something had changed. The balance of power had shifted in an irreversible way. The air inside the house felt different, heavier, as if a line had been crossed that none of them could ever step back over. Danielle was gone, and the house, once filled with reckless joy, now carried the weight of something far more sinister. The morning after the party was eerily quiet. The usual mess of empty bottles and discarded cups littered the living room, but no one was in the mood to clean up. Chris sat at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Jason and Eric were still asleep, unaware of or unconcerned with the storm brewing. Melissa, however, was restless. She hadn't slept at all. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Danielle's pale face as she left the house, her expression unreadable. Danielle didn't answer her phone. Melissa tried calling, texting, even checking her social media, but there was nothing. Hours passed, and the unease in her stomach grew stronger. Something wasn't right. She wanted to believe that Danielle just needed space, but deep down, she knew better. By evening, word had spread that Danielle wasn't in her dorm, hadn't shown up to class, and hadn't spoken to anyone since the party. Friends began asking questions. Her roommate was worried. Calls were made. Within 24 hours, Danielle's family reported her missing. Melissa's hands shook as she listened to the news. The police were getting involved. She knew they would come knocking, and when they did, she wasn't sure how long she could keep quiet. She wasn't even sure what she knew, only that something terrible had happened that night. Chris remained calm, almost unnervingly so. He told Jason and Eric to stay cool, to act normal, to not panic. He assured them that no one could prove anything, that Danielle probably just ran off for a while and would come back when she was ready. He was always good at making people believe what he wanted them to believe. Jason and Eric nodded along, trusting him as they always did. Melissa, however, felt suffocated. She couldn't just sit back and pretend. She thought about going to the police herself, about telling them everything she suspected, but Chris was one step ahead of her. He made it clear that if she talked, they would all go down together. There was no way out for her now. Days passed and Danielle's disappearance dominated the news. Flyers with her face were plastered across campus. Candlelight vigils were organized. The weight of guilt pressed down on Melissa, threatening to break her. Jason and Eric, on the other hand, stuck to Chris's plan, keeping their heads down, speaking only when necessary. When Danielle's body was found in the woods just outside town, everything changed. The details were horrifying. Her injuries, the evidence of violence, the unmistakable proof that she hadn't simply disappeared. The investigation intensified, and suddenly, the 5 of them were under scrutiny. Witnesses from the party remembered seeing Danielle leave with them. Surveillance footage showed her walking into the house that night, but never coming out. The lies they had rehearsed were beginning to unravel. Melissa knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down, and when it did, none of them would walk away unscathed. The discovery of Danielle's body sent shockwaves through the town. The police presence on campus increased overnight, and investigators moved quickly, questioning anyone who had last seen her alive. The 5 friends were at the top of the list. Melissa felt her world closing in. She could barely function, barely eat, barely breathe under the crushing weight of what she knew. She wasn't innocent. She had been there that night, had seen the way Danielle was led away, had felt the wrongness of it all, but done nothing to stop it. Now Danielle was dead. and Melissa couldn't erase the image of her lifeless body from her mind. Chris remained disturbingly calm, instructing Jason and Eric on exactly what to say. He crafted a version of the truth that absolved them of any responsibility. Danielle had been drunk, she had left on her own, they hadn't seen her after the party. He drilled the story into their heads, making sure they all said the same thing. Any slip-up could mean disaster. Jason and Eric followed his lead, but Melissa was spiraling. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep up the act. Every time the police called her in for questioning, her hands shook, her voice cracked, and she could feel their eyes watching her, waiting for her to slip. They knew something wasn't right. The campus turned against them. Once celebrated for their wild parties, they were now whispered about in hushed voices, stared at in the hallways, avoided in public. Danielle had been well liked, and people wanted justice. The pressure was mounting. Then the police uncovered damning evidence. Security cameras from a neighboring house captured Danielle stumbling up the driveway, barely able to walk. The footage showed Chris leading her inside, but there was nothing showing her leaving. The investigation intensified. The police were certain that someone in that house knew what had happened to Danielle, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The pressure became unbearable for Melissa. She had spent days convincing herself she could stay quiet, but the guilt was suffocating. Chris saw the cracks forming. He knew Melissa was the weak link, the one who might turn on them to save herself. He called for a meeting at the house, bringing everyone back together one last time. Jason and Eric went without hesitation, still blindly trusting him, still believing that they could get away with it if they stuck together. Melissa hesitated, her gut screaming at her to stay away. But fear pulled her in. If she didn't go, Chris would know she was a threat. And if Chris saw her as a threat, she knew what would happen next. She stepped inside the house, heart pounding. The door shut behind her with a quiet finality. The walls that had once felt like home now felt like a prison. She knew she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. The house was silent when Melissa stepped inside. The weight of everything that had happened hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Chris stood in the center of the living room, his arms crossed, eyes scanning each of them. Jason and Eric were already there, sitting on the couch, looking uneasy but not afraid. They still believed in Chris, still thought he could find a way out of this. Melissa knew better. She could feel it in her bones. This wasn't just a meeting. It was something else, something final. Chris started talking, his voice calm but laced with something darker. He reminded them of the pact they had made, how they were in this together, and how none of them could afford to break. He spoke about loyalty, about trust, about what would happen if one of them decided to turn on the others. His eyes locked onto Melissa's, and for the first time, she saw the full extent of his control, his manipulation, his willingness to do anything to keep his secrets buried. Melissa's breath hitched. He knew. He knew she was thinking about talking. He knew she wasn't as strong as Jason and Eric, that the guilt was eating her alive. She tried to play it off, shaking her head, mumbling that she wasn't going to say anything. But Chris didn't believe her. He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a near whisper. There was no going back now. Jason and Eric shifted uncomfortably, sensing the shift in the air. They had followed Chris for years, but this was different. This wasn't just covering for something bad they had done. This was something else, something worse. The moment shattered when Melissa made a split-second decision. She bolted for the door, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the lock. But Chris was faster. He grabbed her, yanking her back, his grip like iron. She screamed, but no one outside could hear her. Jason and Eric stood frozen, haste caught between fear and blind loyalty. They had never seen Chris like this, never felt the cold rage radiating off of him. Then it happened fast, too fast for any of them to react. A struggle, a sharp sound, and then Jason was gasping, blood seeping through his fingers where the knife had plunged into his stomach. Chris didn't hesitate. He turned to Eric next, the blade flashing. Melissa scrambled backward, her mind reeling. Jason and Eric lay motionless on the floor, their eyes wide with shock. She barely had time to react before Chris turned toward her. But she wasn't going to let him win. She grabbed the nearest object, a heavy glass bottle, and swung with everything she had. It shattered against his head, sending him staggering. She didn't wait. She ran. The police arrived minutes later, responding to the screams the neighbors had finally heard. They found Melissa outside, covered in blood, shaking, barely able to form words. Inside, Chris lay still, the knife clutched in his hand, the damage irreversible. The nightmare was over, but nothing would ever be the same again.